Part of what was introduced in the learning module is the architecture of each filament, right? So, actin. Remind me, what are the three cytoskeletal filaments? Someone want to tell me?
Micro.
We have that part down. That's good. And the architecture is different in each of them, right?
Yes.
So, actin filaments. Does anyone remember what the architecture? What's the structure look like? Someone raise their hand? Like, no, when I was standing at the board, I was good, but not seeing them. It's like a double helix. It's like a helix of two filaments that kind of intertwine around each other. Microtubules, what do those structures look like? Look at color tubes. You got it, right? Microtubules, small tubes. Intermediate filaments. They got their name because their diameter is intermediate between those two. Actin filaments like 7 nanometers. Microtubules like 25 nanometers. Intermediate filaments are like 10. They're right there closer to the microfilaments, but those. Does anyone remember the descriptor of those? Rope-like. It's regarded as rope-like. And why are intermediate filaments? How are they different than microtubules and microfilaments?
Dynamic, right?
Not dynamic.
Yep. Damn, I learned something, man.
Polar. Yeah, that's right. So once a cell builds an intermediate filament, it's rigid. It's stuck in place. Unless, what are the two situations in which you see, or what's the most prominent situation in which you see intermediate filament breaking down? Cell division, yeah. So that's one where all these intermediate filaments often have to kind of fall apart in order to allow the cell to divide properly. So we'll talk a bit about that in class. Okay, and so what is dynamic? What does that word actually mean? Changing, yeah. Something's dynamic. It's able to change really quickly. And so actin filaments and microtubules, right? I use the analogy on the learning module of like a chain of ants that are going towards some food, right? So they see the food over there, they're going right there. But if they see more food spilled over here, if it's my kids, it's very likely food's going to be everywhere. They're like, oh, sweet, we'll remodel and go in this direction. So both microtubules and actin filaments can do that. They can break down and build themselves back up according to the needs of a cell. And so you see this all the time, like during cell division, or when a cell is migrating, or needs to change shape in any way. Okay. Now, structural polarity. What does structural polarity mean?
One side goes faster, the other side's slower.
Yeah, so at its core, structural polarity just means the two poles are structurally different. And what that means for these filaments, so you were kind of one step ahead, what it means for actin filaments and microtubules is one side, the plus end, is where you see a lot of active growth, polymerization or depolymerization. So it's just that the subunits are able to bind or fall apart easier at what's called the plus end. The minus end, things can slowly bind or slowly come apart. That's called the minus end. So you see really, really slow kind of addition or loss at the minus end. Rapid addition or loss at the plus end. And that's because structurally, just the way those subunits are able to fit in there. One's easy, one more difficult. Okay, treadmill. What's treadmill? Addition and loss of the stuff. Perfect. Yeah, addition and loss. This very technical. So I'm going to start again. No, addition and loss of subunits. That's happening at an equal rate, right? So if you have addition happening at a rate, let's put it into units that we understand. Addition at 1 mile per hour or something, and loss at 1 mile per hour in the back. What's going to happen is you're adding on this side, but then loss is happening on this side. So what ends up, it looks like, is the filament, it looks like it's staying the same size, but you have net growth over here and net loss over here that makes it look like it's moving, right? So it's like on a treadmill, right? The actual, whatever it's called, the part of the treadmill that you run on, right? It stays the same length, and it's just, cursed belt that I still have a mark on my knee from my little incident that I shared with you earlier this semester. Okay. I was actually at a subsequent class, and like all these classes you partner up with someone, and so there's this woman, her name was Colleen, and she said, I recognize you, and I was like, oh yeah, I see you, I'm sure, I see you in the 5:30 a.m. classes. No, you're the one who fell on the treadmill. I was like, all on that. Okay, so we're doing good. One more that I want to make sure you guys get before we go on. Dynamic instability. First of all, which filament is that specific to? Microtubules. And who wants to tell me what it describes, what process it describes in microtubules? It's basic. Go ahead.
I was gonna say when cell division is through, it like they fall apart randomly.
Yeah, and it's not only during cell division. It's kind of anytime you see growth of microtubules. And there was a video on the learning module that kind of makes this more. It's going to be more obvious than my hands doing it. You see because it's composed of these protofilaments, right? So my fingers would be the protofilaments. So they form and add, on the plus end side, they're moving away from that microtubule organizing center where the minus end is stuck to. They grow, and once they get to a certain point, they just like curl out and fall apart. It's called dynamic instability. And once I get to a slide that describes some of the proteins that help the microtubules fall apart, I'll talk a little bit more about exactly why that happens. But so they've noticed, I guess the microtubule scientists notice this quality of microtubules that they'll grow out and then all of a sudden just fall apart unless they're stabilized. There's a protein that can help stabilize them. They will just always fall apart. And the structural reason for that. And that is called dynamic instability. So it's a term specific to microtubules and just describes this process of them, the protofilaments falling apart. Okay. Do you have any questions for me before I go on? No? The review. So this, right, here's like your cheat sheet of all the different proteins that you will know and love by the end of this week. In the learning module, you'll notice that, or in the module itself on Canvas, you'll notice that there's like a cytoskeleton protein worksheet. It's just another way for you to categorize these proteins. So that's a chart just to help you guys study and kind of help categorize these proteins and help draw connections amongst what those proteins are doing. Because what you'll find is, holy crap, this is a lot of proteins. But what you'll find is the proteins that are aiding in actin filament assembly, they are proteins that aid in microtubule assembly to do the same process, just as a different protein. So this chart kind of helps you categorize the proteins according to their function for building or destroying or making shapes out of each actin filaments microtubules. All right. So in this lecture, we're going to start out talking a little bit more about molecular motors, right? Which I introduced the concept of when we talked about vesicular trafficking. So we'll talk a little bit more about them and talk about the different subtypes. And then we'll move on to talking about all these proteins that help build up and break down cytoskeletal filaments. All right, so molecular motors. These are proteins, right, that move along either microtubules or actin filaments. There's no molecular motor that we've identified that runs along intermediate filaments. So molecular motors are specific to either actin filaments or microtubules. And they motor along, right? So someone actually sent me a cool video of molecular motor walking along some cytoskeletal filament, and maybe I'll try to post it for you within the context of our module. It's so cool watching these proteins work. So they have, I always think of them as feet that are attached to the filament, and then that's where they have the ATPase domain. So they're energized by the hydrolysis of ATP. That helps these globular heads walk along. And then they have a cargo binding domain where they bind their cargo. Now, cargo can really be anything. It can be a single molecule, right? It could be like a piece of mRNA. So one thing that you see happen with mRNA is once it's exported from the nucleus, a lot of times mRNA will get localized to a specific region of the cell before it's translated. And that allows it, right, if you move the RNA to the specific region of the cell in which the protein it encodes is needed, right when it's translated, cool, that protein's right where it needs to be. So this is really important, like in neurons, for example, where you need proteins that need to get all the way down to the axon termini or way out into the dendrites. What will happen is the RNA gets localized first by molecular motors, moves the mRNA to a specific subregion of the cell, and then it gets translated, and the protein's like, oh, cool, this is where I need to be. Fantastic. Molecular motors can also move, right, as you know, vesicles, right? Big old vesicles. They can also help move entire organelles as well. And you see this happen when cells migrate. Molecular motors are integral in helping move the cell contents forward. So we'll revisit that when we get to our cell movement lecture. Okay, so the three basic types of molecular motors. First, there's myosins, right? And myosins, we've talked to, what structure have we talked a lot about with respect to myosins? So, yeah, sarcomeres, right? Is that what you guys said? Yeah. Okay, cool, sarcomeres. That was correct. The sarcomeres. Myosins encode a big old family of proteins. There's a ton of different myosins. And also, there's one type of myosin that functions within the sarcomere, and there are other myosins. What all myosins have in common is that they walk along actin filaments. And they typically, so molecular motors are directional. And what I mean by that is any given molecular motor is going to walk in a specific direction, either towards the plus end or towards the minus end on the cytoskeletal filament. So most myosins walk towards the plus end. There is one that moves towards the minus end. Okay, so that is the molecular motor of actin filaments, myosins. Microtubules have two molecular motors. One, kinesins, they move towards the plus end. So the microtubule organizing center, who remembers where that's located in the cell? Near the nucleus, right? And it's attached to the myosin. That means kinesins are great for moving things that need to move from a region near the nucleus out towards like the periphery of the cell. Periphery meaning like the outer limits of the cell. Right, so it moves towards the plus end. And dyneins are the opposite. They move along microtubules towards the minus end. So they move in the opposite direction, like from the cell periphery toward the nucleus. Okay. So those are the three flavors. Yeah.
Which is the head and which is the carbohydrate?
Oh yeah, that's kind of a crap picture. Here, let's go here.
Oh, okay.
The globular heads are, or you refer to the globular heads, but I think of them as like the feet that are walking, right? So maybe you want to think. The globular regions are the part that attach to the filament, the cytoskeletal filament. So this is the part that would attach to either the actin filament or the microtubule. And then it has this kind of fibrous region, and at the end of it, or in this area would be like the cargo binding domain, right? So it attaches to the filament, and it's gonna walk in one direction along the filament, and it's gonna carry its cargo on its fibrous scale. So the heads are what have the ATPase activity, right? That's where ATPase activity, it refers to the hydrolysis of ATP to ADP, right? So it's breaking that high energy phosphate bond, ATPase activity. And the structure of the heads is really what they bind to the filament in a specific way that determines basically which direction, right? So the heads are only able to associate with the filaments and move along them in one direction. That's what it means by dictate filament track and direction. So those are the ones that either have affinity for, depending on the motor, actin filaments or microtubules, and the structure of those globular heads are what determine which direction it's going to walk on that filament. It's just its feet only work in a particular order. And then speed is essentially how fast are they able to hydrolyze ATP. Right? The faster they hydrolyze ATP, the faster they can move along the filament. Tails, again, are cargo binding. Okay, so there's actually, have you guys all heard of the Khan Academy?
Yeah.
It's so good, right? I know there's a lot of molecular ones that don't go into a lot of great detail, but their video on molecular motors is pretty cool if you want to spend more time learning about molecular motors. So I felt like I watched that video and they did a really good job of describing what this image is trying to get across, which is, so each of those globular heads can have ATPase activity, and not only does the hydrolysis of ATP give that energy currency, but it also changes the structure. It provides, it helps provide a kink to help the domain move forward. So the ATP binding and hydrolysis on the globular heads lead to a conformational change that aids in walking, right? And whatever's associated with the cargo comes along for the ride on the cargo binding domains. Comes along for the ride. So all the movement is happening down here at these heads, and it's dependent on ATP hydrolysis. And that's really the extent of what I expect you to understand for this class. If you want to understand it in more, I nerd out on molecular motors. I think they're so cool. So if you do want to learn more, check out that Khan Academy. I can even send you guys the link. It's so cool. Because I don't think I incorporated it on the learning module because it was like 10 minutes. It goes in way more detail than I want to. Yeah.
So in this picture, you have the ATP in the back.
Yeah.
One of the phosphorus is taking away.
That's right.
Turning it into ATP.
Yeah.
And phosphorus is getting to the ATP.
Because the first
Oh, no,
First slide was just
there's
introduction.
there's other, not exactly. Yeah.
deeper here.
So you have the ATP hydrolysis occurs,
Both sides
and
cheaper.
then
Shipping
typically what happens, okay, let's see, so
2% cheaper.
let's try to follow this one. So you have an ATP hydrolysis event, and that's going to cause, what they're trying to show here, okay, they show the blue here is helping you trace which head they're referring to. So here what happens, you have an ATP hydrolysis event, and that's facilitated by the head. And that event, what they don't do a great job of showing, that actually creates a kink that allows it to release and move forward. And then I think this one, what they're not doing a good job of showing here is what happens is it loses this ADP and it's exchanged for a new ATP. So a lot of times what happens with ATPases, and we'll see this again, when you go to the hydrolysis event, and this is the same with GTP hydrolysis, the GTP or ATP will get hydrolyzed to form ADP or GDP, right? But then when you want it to bind GTP or ATP again, what happens is you lose the ADP and a new ATP will bind. Right? So it's not like the same ADP, a new phosphate bond is formed there. That's not what happens usually on these proteins. So you lose the ADP, a new ATP binds, and then it's hydrolyzed, causes a kink, moves forward. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm going to come back to that concept actually when we talk about actin and GTP hydrolysis, or ATP hydrolysis. Okay. So here's an image showing a molecular motor doing its stuff. So first, I'm going to direct your attention to what's happening in the peach structures. So here is an actin filament, right? And so formin is one of the proteins that helps nucleate actin, right? Nucleate is like so it helps bring those initial globular actin subunits together, and it associates with the plus end. And what happens is it keeps adding at the plus end, and oftentimes the filament will grow out in the minus direction. So it's just adding, and it's adding here, so it adds, and everything grows out. Even though the addition is happening at the plus end, it seems like it's growing out in this direction, right? Just add here, and if you keep adding, right, it's going to push the rest of the filament in that direction. Does that make sense? I see some people doing this and others doing this. There's actually a video on the learning module that shows formin doing its thing. I highly recommend watching that video because it is trying to make sense of this in a static 2D image is really hard. So those movies can kind of really help visualize what's going on. All right, so here's our actin filament. And here's our molecular motor in green. So in this case, what's happening is this molecular motor, it's attached to this cargo that there's a lot of extra details here, but what it's moving along are these proteins that are associated to an mRNA. And this myosin is going to move towards the plus end and help traffic that RNA out to the periphery of the cell. And so this information actually came from a paper that was published where they were studying exactly how this ASH1 mRNA, how it gets localized out to the periphery of cells. And it had to do with these proteins that help connect it to a molecular motor to drive that transcript out to the periphery of the cell to help localize it. And so the cells use molecular motors all the time to do just this. So localize different cellular components to specific locations in the cell. Right, so you can think. I always think of the filaments as like a series of railroad tracks, right? And the different molecular motors are the trains that run along those tracks, right? And these trains have all different types of cargo, and that's exactly how those motor proteins function. Okay, do you guys have questions on molecular motors before I move on to something else? That was not cool. Coffee flashed in the face. So now my whole face is going to smell like coffee, so maybe it's a win. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to how cells can regulate their function by controlling the cytoskeleton. Right, so you learn kind of the basics of cytoskeletal filaments on the learning module. And now we're going to learn all about how cells can manipulate those structures to perform specific functions, right? Because the filaments themselves, they're just the building material, right? And they, like, if you put a bunch of like globular actin in a tube, some of them might find each other. You're not going to really know how to form shapes or do anything. It's all these associated proteins that really help build them up in an organized way and form specific structures. It's really all about these associated proteins that instruct the cytoskeletal filament how to form, when to form, where to form, how to break down, the rate at which that happens. All right, so what are we looking at in green right here? Which filament? Microtubule. Guess what this big green dot is? It's microtubule organizing center. Right? So microtubule organizing center is always going to be by the nucleus, and then you see the microtubules emanating out from there. All right. Now, let's see this one. This is kind of tough. So first, let's talk about the green one that you see mostly concentrated out at the periphery of the cell. What do you think that one is? Actin. So actin, you often see actin. And if you can see kind of these yellow fibers. You see actin throughout cells, but you see it most concentrated in this meshwork at the cell periphery, just under the cell membrane. All right, red, this kind of mishmash of filaments that are everywhere. What do you think that one is? Yeah, you got it, intermediate filaments. This is another one. So intermediate filaments, there are some, they can be cytosolic, they can be in the nucleus. It depends on what cell type you're talking about and what intermediate filament. So in the learning module, it says, intermediate filaments are composed of heterogeneous protein family. What I mean by that is, when talking microtubules, it's always going to be dimers of tubulin that make up a microtubule. So talking about an actin filament, it's always going to be globular actin that bind together to form an actin filament. Intermediate filaments, oh my gosh, there's a ton of different proteins. So lamins, those are the ones that are specific to the nucleus. They hold the nuclear envelope together. There is vimentin, which is a type of intermediate filament that's specific to like mesenchymal cells, connective tissue cells. There are, let's see, keratin in your hair and nails, and in the your stratified squamous epidermis layer. Remember all that terminology? That's keratin, the intermediate filaments. And so intermediate filaments, they always have this rope-like structure, but there are different proteins that can make up that rope-like structure. Okay, and there are examples of different intermediate filaments. I think I just listed some of them, and then another one. There's a specific intermediate filament that helps reinforce the structure of the sarcomere. They're all over the place. Okay. So let's start with actin. So weird, like this 85-degree day. In the morning I was freezing.
Yeah, it's pretty hot today.
I feel like I'm gonna want to wear like sandals later. But I'm not going to wear them.
It's hot.
TMI, you guys
It's
know
hot, man.
what I think about my shoes. All right. Ready for this?
Sure.
No. Okay. Deep breath. You do this, we can do this. All right. So actin filaments. Again, these filaments can be assembled and disassembled really quickly. They can help regulate a ton of different cellular activities. They can help facilitate cell movement. The formation is totally different dependent on this class of proteins called MFAPs, microfilament associated proteins. So actin filaments, I think actin filament is the same thing as a microfilament. I just chose to stick with actin filament because our textbook specifically used actin filament. But actin filament. Actin filament equals microfilament, same thing. So, filament. So, MFAP equals.
I'm just gonna go outside. It's pretty hot.
Okay, so this table includes all the microfilament proteins that we're going to talk about, categorized underneath the process in which they're described as eating. Okay, so the way the textbook categorizes these is, so first, nucleation. So nucleation is the initial formation of bringing together those initial monomers, right? The initial G-actin subunits, bringing them together. And two of the most prominent nucleating proteins are formin and ARP23. We're going to talk about those and how they are different. So they nucleate actin differently, but they're both nucleators. So they both can help bring the initial G-actin subunits together to start building that F-actin, that filamentous actin. This is considered the rate-limiting step for filament formation. It's the slowest. Okay. Kinetics. So this speed at which these filaments polymerize, right? Because remember, we're building an actin filament. It's building an actin polymer, right? So actin is an example of a protein that only functions within the context of a polymer. Many actin subunits together. All right. So there's thymosin, profilin, and capping protein, and these are three proteins that are critical in determining the speed at which those G-actin subunits get added to the growing filament. They have very different roles in that. We'll talk about that. Shape. So once you have an actin filament, it can form multiple shapes. There are three common flavors. So two of the structures are parallel bundles. So where you have actin filaments that are just lined up right next to each other. They can be really, really close to each other, or they can be a little bit further apart. And so what happens is there are what's called filament binding proteins. They're sometimes also called filament bundling proteins that basically bind to either side of the filament to dictate that conformation. So they almost act as like spacers. So they'll create a teeny tiny space or a larger space. So look at that. They can also form meshworks, so crisscross meshworks of actin filaments. And that is also, also reinforced by a protein that'll help kind of lock that meshwork into place. So we'll look at those. Durability. So there are these proteins that can help determine permanence. So you can, if you have a stable actin structure and you want it to not be permanent, you want to break it down, usually what happens is the cell activates or expresses gelsolin and cofilin, and they will help with disassembly of those structures. We'll talk about that. So first, nucleation. All right. So formin. The first protein we're going to talk about. And formin nucleates actin polymerization. In this image, formin is green by capturing two actin monomers. And once nucleated, once you get that initial nucleation event, the rest of the polymer can grow out much more rapidly. So formin, it stays associated with the plus end. So so here it's captured. All right. I wish this image started with the initial nucleation event. So the initial nucleation event would have been bringing together like these subunits down here, right? And then what it does is it does this like formin dance where it's like, and it keeps like capturing more and stays attached to that plus end, and it keeps adding subunits onto that plus end, right? So it's here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and every time it does this, captures another one, switches up, captures another one, captures another one. So this image, what it's trying to show is that formin stays associated with that plus end, the rapidly growing end, and keeps aiding in its rapid growth by helping to capture G-actin subunits to add to that growing end, right? So it just keeps doing this pivot. And that, again, there's video footage of that, which is much better than me doing this weird thing up here. All right, so one of the key features of formin that differentiates it from the other nucleating protein we're going to learn about is it forms these straight, unbranched chains of actin. It forms straight, unbranched filaments. It doesn't like take a turn here. It just keeps building a straight, unbranched filament. And it stays associated with the plus end. Okay. Are you with me there? Okay. So that's different than ARP complexes. So ARP stands for actin-related proteins. ARP complex is used interchangeably with ARP23. The ARP complex actually consists of 7 different proteins. ARP2 and ARP3 are the 2 prominent ones for which it is named after. Okay. The most important thing to understand about ARP complexes is not that it's composed of 7 proteins, it's what its function is. Okay? and it also functions to nucleate growth. But it's different than formin in that it's a little bit lazier. It just stays attached. It stays attached to the minus end. So basically, it nucleates growth, it brings the subunits together, and then once it participates in that nucleation, it's like, oh, I'm done here. I'm just going to stay attached to the minus end and allow G-actin subunits to figure it out on their own on the plus end, right? So in this image, each of these green things are representing an actin or an ARP complex, right? The red is the actin filament. So what ARP would do, or what it does, is it captures the initial G-actin subunits, and then it just anchors that filament, and then you would have addition happening here. And this would grow out in this direction. So plus end, this is the plus end, and this would be the minus end. So formin stays attached to the plus end, kind of continues aiding in growth. Whereas ARP complexes help bring together those initial G-actin subunits and then just stays attached at that minus end. Right. The other thing that ARP does is that not only does it on one side nucleate growth, it will bind to an already existing actin filament at a very specific angle, right? It binds it at this angle of 70 degrees to help make this tree-like web. Okay, so these actin networks or actin meshworks that are sometimes also called gels, just basically means filaments that are crisscrossed. You need ARP to be involved in the nucleation, because this is the only way you get the initiation of the meshwork, is to have ARP facilitating that, right? ARP is what binds on one end of a filament, and then its other end, right, the circle part, will bind to an already established filament at a very specific angle. So if you have a bunch of ARP present, you're just going to naturally end up getting all these angled connections. Does that make sense? All right. So in order to get this meshwork, you need to have ARP complexes present. You also need to have them active. So one of the ways that a cell can regulate the formation of these gels is not just whether or not ARP is present, it's regulating a protein called activating factor. All right, so here's our cartoon of the ARP complex, right? And so in the absence of activating factor, it has this conformation that prevents it from binding to the actin monomers. When activating factor is present, it binds on one side of the ARP complex, changes its conformation at the binding site. That allows it to bind actin and facilitate or nucleate that growth. Right? So cells can manipulate actin polymerization by manipulating expression not just of ARP complex, but of activating factor. So if you have ARP around but no activating factor, ARP can't do its job. What type of regulation is happening there? I actually just got a feeling of warmth inside. That made me, yeah. Yes, that's the allosteric, right? Because here's ARP, it's in a conformation that precludes binding of actin. Once activating factor binds in ARP's, it looks like bottom, it changes the conformation at the actin binding site, right? So two different binding sites on that same protein complex. Fantastic. Allosteric. Is that positive or negative allosteric? Oh, yeah, that's okay. All right, so that's nucleation, right? So both ARP23 and formin nucleate the growth of these actin filaments. They do so pretty differently. Okay. So thymosin and profilin help regulate the speed of actin polymerization. Right? Kinetics, the rate of polymerization. And they're opposites. So profilin likes to speed up the rate of polymerization, where thymosin likes to slow it down. And in fact, if there's only thymosin around, it can actually inhibit it. So how does thymosin inhibit polymerization? It actually will keep the actin in what's called a locked state. So what it's trying to show here is when so actin would be in red, thymosin would be in green. When thymosin binds, it actually binds to the part of the G-actin that wants to bind to the filament. So it actually blocks its binding site. So it totally prevents its ability to bind to that filament, blocks it. What it also does is, so it keeps it locked in an ADP bound state. So actin subunits, for G-actin to bind to the growing filament, it has to be in an ATP bound state. So if you have a growing filament, I'm going to draw this. Slow it down. Slow it down a second. All right. So, okay. So this is our plus n. This is our minus n. So you tend to see the highest amount of growth at the plus end. Okay. What happens is that actin can only add to the growing chain when it's in an ATP-bound conformation. And it binds in an ATP-bound state, and then it slowly gets hydrolyzed to the ADP. So typically, if you see loss coming from the minus N, and I'll talk to you why we typically do see loss of the minus N, it's usually because the depolymerizing proteins grab the actin from the minus N. They're in an ATP or ADP bound state, right? So if you have a free pool of actin, this one can bind because it's in the ATP conformation. This one cannot because it's ADP. So in order to get this G-actin monomer to be usable again, you need to exchange out to ADP for ATP, right? Okay, so what happens is profilin will bind to these G-actin subunits that are ADP bound, and it will prevent them from exchanging their ADP for ATP. I said thymosin, right? Did I say thymosin? Oh, F minus Dr. Mulligan, no! So thymosin, so then I have to write it all out. So thymosin does two things. One, blocks ability of G-actin to bind F-actin. Right, in F-actin, that means that the filament. And two, will prevent exchange of ADP for ATP. So to lock it, thymosin locks in ADP.
It's already full.
Okay, so this is thymosin, right? So if you want to limit the growth of your filament or you want to slow it down, you can express thymosin. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that got messy. I apologize. Okay? Okay.
More thymosin.
Gosh. Yeah, thymosin. Let's
More blockage.
What you're saying is do better.
Less
No, do not apologize.
TP.
So this is thymosin. Thymosin, I'll say it as I write it. Thymosin locks in ADP bound state. Better? Okay. Alright, so profilin does the opposite. Profilin is what you want around if you want to speed up the rate of actin polymerization. It steps on the gas. So what profilin does is it facilitates the exchange of ADP for ATP. So it helps those ADP-bound G-actins get rid of their ADP so that they can bind ATP. Not only that, it binds it in a way that, it binds the G-actin in a way that competes with thymosin binding. Yeah, erase this and write up what's happening in the profiling.
It's on the paper.
When you learn what happened, but that formula is the opposite. Huh?
Did you guys see a promote conversation? Just be types it, is it?
Yeah, that's
Okay, so it can promote exchange of ADP for ATP, and it can block or compete away thymosin binding.
okay.
And the way that it binds the G-actin, it doesn't interfere with its ability to bind to that F-actin. It helps pass it off to the growing filament. And there are actually profilins that are specialized to work with formin. So they help pass off the G-actin to the formin that's doing its formin dance at the plus end. So this is a case of a lot of times, if you have both profilin and thymosin around, oh, go ahead, Kristen.
So you just need the ATP to add on, no, for the actin to be usable by like promoted protein. I mean, once it's added on, like, forget about the ATP.
So, oh yeah, because the ATP and the actin filament has nothing to do with motor proteins.
Okay.
Yeah, the ATP is different. That has to do with the ATP on the motor heads. This is the ATP that is actually within the G-actin protein itself.
Cool.
Right? So if you had like a motor protein walking along here, it would be utilizing its own ATP. Yeah. So there is, and in the cell, in the cytosol, there's a higher relative level of GTP and ATP around. So if protein is to lose, if you kick out the ADP, or in the case of proteins that have GDP, you kick that out, there's going to be GTP or ATP molecules around that can now take up that binding site.
So during treadmilling, are there different concentrations at different ends? Like the plus side would have, if it was increasing, you'd have more profilin, and then at the minus end, you would have thymosin, preventing growth?
We'll get there. No, thymosin and profilin typically both affect the plus end.
Okay.
They typically both affect the plus end. So they promote or prevent growth at the plus end. When you have treadmilling, going on, you have another protein called cofilin that we'll get there in just a few slides.
Okay.
Cofilin ripping the subunits off of the minus end. Right, so we're dealing with the plus end right now. So in a cell, right, basically, whichever there's a higher concentration of is going to win. Because profilin and thymosin are both competing for access to that G-actin. So if you have a higher level of thymosin than profilin, well, it's going to win the battle, and you're going to have slower growth of those active filaments. But if all of a sudden the cell wants to increase that rate of filament polymerization, we'll increase the amount of profilin that's present. You increase the level of profilin over thymosin, now it's going to win the battle, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Thymosin prevents, profilin prevents. Okay. All right, and again, they compete for G-actin binding. And you see this all the time in the cell. There are a lot of proteins that are competing for access to the same protein. And that's where you have something, right, competitive binding happening, where one binding is going to block binding of the other. And so the way that works in the context of the cell is the one that's functional output you see is the one that has the higher concentration, typically. Okay. Or if the concentration is high but it's not winning, that means there's something else inhibiting the activity of that protein. Does that concept make sense? Ish. Okay. Or nothing makes sense, and I really want to nap. Okay. All right, so the one other protein that falls into the category of kinetics is this protein called capping protein. It's called capping protein because it caps off the filaments. So if you want, right, typically you want to grow a filament to a particular length. You don't want it growing to infinity, that would be sad. Right, and so once the filament gets to the length that is required, what the cell does is it can cap off growth at the plus end. So this is what enables the ability to have these long-term stable actin filaments. It's by preventing growth and depolymerization at that plus end, where you see all this rapid growth and polymerization. There's no capping protein around, right? So what capping protein does, it binds to the plus end and just prevents addition of any more monomers or loss of any G-actin monomers. So it does both. And so what happens is you can still see relatively slow growth or really slow loss, but at the minus end, again, it happens if there's nothing else at work, if there's no proteins affecting the minus end, the minus end doesn't really fall apart or grow that much on its own. It's so slow. So in this graph that they're trying to show is in the presence of capping protein, you see this really slow growth rate, whereas in the absence of capping protein, it's like it's growing and growing and growing. And so if you're a cell and you're building an actin filament, in order to get it to stop growing and build a long-term stable fiber, you want capping protein present. Does that idea make sense? Okay. Okay. All right. It takes a while for those questions to come. Yay, look at that! It's like magic.
For thymosin as well as the cap binding, so when formula is doing this little wobble, it creates a longer actin filament.
Yeah.
Either the thymosin or the cap binding can stop stabilizing.
Sorry, go ahead.
So can the cap binding and the thymosin, if they both are interacting with the active filament, is there any way to distinguish the two? Like, if there's like, doesn't the cap stops it from growing as well as thymosin stops it from growing?
Okay,
Will they
so
both be stable?
thymosin, though, that's a great question. All right, so this is, let me see if my answer helps. So thymosin, what it's gonna do, it's gonna prevent extra growth on the end, but, so it's gonna prevent subunits from adding on, but at that plus end, you can still have subunits falling off, right? Unless you have the capping protein. Does that make sense? So the capping protein, no, that's a great question, because it doesn't just like that, the reason I think you asked that question is because the chart just makes it seem like that capping protein limits growth. It also limits the loss of those subunits.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, but they both target the plus side, right?
You got it.
Okay.
They do. And we'll get to, the minus side on its own is just kind of, it's not totally stable, right? So you can have monomers that can really slowly bind and really slowly fall apart. But usually, when you see activity happening at the minus side, like if treadmilling is happening, it's because there's a protein called covalent that's helping rip those subunits apart. So we'll get there. All right. Yeah.
So for thymosin, is it only locked into that ADP state as long as it's like physically on that same actin, or does it like leave, continue doing that, and then that one's like just kind of stuck for a while, and then eventually?
Okay, wait, hold on. Repeat it. If you have.
For thymosin, does it only lock that actin into that ADP state as long as it's on it?
Yep. Yeah.
Or
As
once
long
it,
as
like,
it's
leaves, it's
yeah.
like doing it?
You got it.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Great questions. All right. Yeah, no.
I have a question about dynamics. So you said that Formin will just sync in a single line. It will create no nuclei continuously in a single line. So how does it make active dynamics? So how would it be able to change its shape? Is what I'm trying to ask.
How does it make what? How does it make what?
How would it be able to change its shape if Formin it only allows it to add like in a line?
Yeah, so if you also had ARP complexes present, if you had ARP complexes present, they could start, you have ARP that could also start binding to those straight lines that were facilitated by Formin.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the other, yeah. No. Thank you. No problem. Yeah.
The thymosin is the one that prevents nucleation by ARP?
Oh, it prevents thymosin doesn't prevent nucleation. It slows down polymerization. Slows down and inhibits polymerization. So nucleation is where that is when you just bring the initial subunits together. I mean, I suppose if you had enough thymosin around, it could also prevent nucleation, sure. But what it's really known for is when you have post-nucleation, when you have a filament that's growing, thymosin slow down or inhibit the ability of the active monomers to add to that growing filament.
So the activating factor is the one.
You've got it. Activating factor is what you need to have ARP. There's a lot of proteins thrown at you, but once you that's why I gave you that chart. Once you remember the names and what they're doing, then you can start really appreciating cytoskeletal dynamics, which is so important for understanding how a cell functions. Okay, so we figured out how to grow these filaments. How do you get them into shape? That's where these filament binding proteins, that are sometimes also called bundling proteins, come into play. All right, and we're going to talk about 3. So on this slide, we have actinin, or alpha-actinin, and fibrin. Both actinin and fibrin they function as spacers, and either side of the protein will bind to an actin filament, and so it creates, it functions as like a spacer, and it helps bring those filaments together in these parallel bundles. Okay. The difference, though, is alpha-actinin is longer, so it allows more space to exist between the actin filaments, whereas fibrin is really teeny bitty. And so you get these really tight, compact bundles. So where you see alpha-actinin is anywhere where you need myosin to get in there, right? So anywhere you see actin functioning, participating in anything that has to do with contraction, right? So in like a sarcomere, or in the contractile ring that helps the endothelium and pinch apart those cells. Anywhere you need contraction to happen, you need more space. Because what happens is myosin needs to have access to both of these filaments. It needs to have space to get in there and perform its contraction, right? To help move those filaments, either together or apart, right? Which is what's happening when contraction occurs. So anywhere you see a contractile bundle of actin filaments, you can count on alpha-actinin being involved. Now, I always remember it as contraction actinin, right? Contract, like the ACT. Yeah. So, okay, yeah, that's okay. So if I say anything about contraction and a binding protein, it's alpha-actinin. You do not have to think further.
Got it.
Contraction is involved.
Exam question.
The binding protein involved is going to be alpha-actinin. Now, by contrast, if you just need a dense old network of parallel actin filaments to give structural rigidity to a cellular structure, and you don't need myosin to get in there, you don't need contraction happening, that's where you have fibrin. So you know how our intestinal epithelium have microvilli? Those microvilli, the reason the microvilli in the cells aren't like flipping over all the time is these really densely packed parallel actin filaments in the microvilli that give it its structural integrity. So loose packing allows myosin to enter the bundle. Tight packing would then prevent myosin. Okay, the next shape are those meshworks, the crisscross meshworks. So this shape is initiated by ARP complexes, right? ARP complexes is what allows you to connect the actin filaments in such a way that they have this kind of crisscrossivity happening. Filament comes in and reinforces that meshwork though. So filament are these L-shaped proteins that just basically reinforce the crisscross by one L binding one filament and the other L binding the other filament at the crossing location. Wait, what'd you just say? Intersection. That's the word. Words are at the intersection of the filament. Yes, intersection. I like that I can spew out all these molecular biology words for like normal words. Okay. So that is what filament can help reinforce and stabilize those actin webs, which are also sometimes called gels. And filament, I remember that as the crisscross one because I just, when I visualize it, I actually think of this image. I think of the L's. Filament has an L in it. These are the tools that we rely on, right, to keep this information in our brain. So here's an actual image. So I mentioned microvilli. So in microvilli, you have this dense network of actin filaments. And the way that they're packed in there is via that little teeny tiny fibrin that allows them to pack really tightly together. So here's an actual image of microvilli. So this is just a piece of one cell in our intestinal epithelium. So here's the microvilli. And so you can see, or kind of these parallel flat rows, those are the actin filament bundles. All right. Cool. Okay. So the final quality that we're going to talk about for actin filaments is the idea of permanence. So these actin filaments can I mentioned in the learning module, they can stick around for a few minutes or they can last for the entire lifetime of the cell. Now, if you're in a situation where you want to break down an actin filament and you want to do so quickly, how do you accomplish that, right? Because you have this big old long polymer. And so that's one of the cool features of actin filaments is that the cell has a mechanism to break them down super fast. Break them down super fast and then recycle all those actin subunits so it can rebuild some cool network of actin filaments somewhere else for some other purpose. So, this is called a process of coordinated disassembly of existing fibers, which is a fancy way of saying it's breaking down the fibers in a regulated way. And to have rapid disassembly, you need two proteins. All right, so one of them is called gelsolin. Gelsolin is known as a severing protein. And it has this cool feature where it will sever and then it'll sever, bless you, sever and then cap at the plus end. So if you're trying to break it down, why would capping be important? You don't want it to grow at all anymore, right? So you cut it and then you cap that plus end, so it's like, ha, you cannot grow anymore. So that's cool, it severs into these pieces. So instead of having one big old long filament, it cuts it up into smaller pieces, right? So now, you want to break it up into polymers. That's where this protein called cofilin comes in. So I mentioned this before, cofilin rips apart the filament at the minus end. So cofilin will just attack those minus ends and rip it all apart. All right, so if you have just gelsolin, if you only had gelsolin, what would happen to your filament?
Cut in half.
Yeah, you just get cut into like fragments, right? Okay. What happens if you only have cofilin?
Pieces. Individual.
Slowly, because it only has one minus end to attack, right? And sometimes that's fine, but if you want to destroy a big old actin filament or a bunch of them, if you have gelsolin and cofilin, oh man, now you're in business. Because what happens is, right, so if we have here's our plus and here's our minus. And then alright, another color. Alright, so if we only gelsolin, you would just get fragments, right? So you one. Okay, fine, but now we don't have subunits to use, right, for the building of a new polymer. We need to get them into subunit form, to the individual G-actin subunit. So if we have, here we have gelsolin and cofilin. Okay, cool. So what happens here is, let me draw. So here, there's plus, minus, because everywhere you sever, right, you're creating two new ends. So here, gelsolin would have severed and capped. Okay, we have our fragments. Here, we severed and capped, but at our minus end, now we have cofilin attacking there, and there to disassemble into the individual subunits. So if you only had cofilin here, how many minus ends do you have?
One.
One. What gelsolin does is it helps create a bunch of tiny fragments with a bunch of minus ends that cofilin can then go and attack and disassemble. So that's why the combination of gelsolin and cofilin leads to rapid disassembly. So, only cofilin depolymerization would be slow. Cofilin, or gelsolin, just creates fragments. Fragments of like mini polymers. Here we get rapid disassembly. Due to the combination, right, of getting multiple minus ends plus cofilin attacking and disassembling all this. Make sense?